From the Sunshine State, this is Tampa Bay's Tan Talk.
Good afternoon. It is 3:05 here on Tampa Bay's Tan Talk Radio Network, the Legal Forum, and today we're going to be talking about adoption. If you want to give us a call in studio, the numbers are 727-441-3000 in Pinellas County, or toll-free nationwide, 1-866-826-1340. We'll be taking your calls in just a little bit here. Our guest today is Jeanne Tate. Ms. Tate is currently the managing partner of the law office of Jeanne T. Tate, PA, with offices in Naples, Orlando, and Tampa. She is a board-certified adoption attorney and AV rated by Martindale-Hubbell. Ms. Tate has an extensive and exclusive practice in the area of adoptions and has participated in the placement of over 2,500 children in loving homes. As a member of the prestigious American Academy of Adoption Attorneys and the Florida Adoption Council, Jeanne has been active in interstate compact adoptions and has a comprehensive knowledge of adoption law. She works closely with adoption agencies to provide a full range of services to birth parents and adoptive families, and owns her own adoption agency, Heart of Adoptions, Inc. Ms. Tate graduated with high honors in 1978 from the University of Florida with a BS degree in journalism, and in 1981 she graduated with honors from the University of Florida College of Law. Ms. Tate consistently has been named as one of the best lawyers in America. Over the years, Ms. Tate has been the recipient of several prestigious honors and awards, including Best Lawyers 2013, Tampa Family Lawyer of the Year, 2012 Tobias Simon Pro Bono Award, Super Lawyers Top 50 Women Attorneys in Florida, a Congressional Award as an Angel in Adoption, ABA Solo and Small Firm Lifetime Achievement Award, U.S. News Top Tier Best Lawyers, Best Law Firm, Tampa Bay Parenting Magazine Extraordinary Woman, Guardian Angel, Voices for Children, Tampa Bay Business Journal Businesswoman of the Year, and Small Business Leader of the Year by the Tampa Chamber of Commerce 2006. Ms. Tate's professional affiliations include the following: United States Supreme Court, Florida Bar, Hillsborough County Bar Association, Florida Association of Women Lawyers, the Bay Area Volunteer Lawyers Program, the Athena Society, and the Hillsborough County Association for Women Lawyers. She has appeared on national and local television on the subject of adoption and lobbies extensively in this area. That's a mouthful. It's good to have you on the show today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your practice?
Well, I've practiced in the adoption field for over 30 years now, and people ask me what is an ordinary day like, and really the ordinary is the extraordinary. We really feel like we're doing God's work to be able to find children adoptive homes and find adoptive families that want to adopt children, an opportunity to parent those children through successfully to adulthood. So we run the gamut from working with birth parents and adoptive parents on the social side, and then working in the courtroom on the legal side to secure adoptive placements.
Excellent. And before we get started, can you give some of your contact information for our listeners?
Certainly. Probably the easiest is through our website at floridaadoptionattorney.com. We also have offices in Tampa, Orlando, and Naples with individual phone numbers, but mine specifically is 813-258-3355, and I can always be reached by email at Jeanne, Jeanne, at jtatelaw.com.
Excellent. And if you have any questions, again, you can call in 727-441-3000. Now, I have a lot of questions here that I'd like to get through, so I guess we'll get started. At the outset, what is the most important advice that you can give birth parents and adoptive parents?
I think there's probably no more important thing for either a birth parent or adoptive parent than to hire a competent and reputable adoption professional to work with in connection with their adoption planning. It's probably the most important area to be a knowledgeable consumer, to make sure that the individuals that you entrust these really important family matters, have the integrity and the ability to get the job done in the best way possible. And I think as a resource, the American Academy of Adoption Attorneys, which is a national organization that has very high standards as far as ethics and competence, is a good place for folks to start.
Okay, interesting. What rights do birth mothers have?
Well, in my house, we always say if mama's not happy, nobody's happy.
Yes, I follow those rules as well.
So I would translate that into the birth mother arena and really say that to a large degree, she's in charge of her adoption. She has the right to have her questions answered honestly and truthfully. She has the right to an adoption attorney if she believes that she needs one to make these important parenting decisions or adoption decisions. She has the right to counseling. There's a lot of grief and loss associated with choosing an adoption, even though it may be a decision that's in the best interest of the child and also the best interest of the birth mother. But she should seek counsel about that on the legal and psychological side. Birth mothers in Florida are also entitled to have their medical bills paid by the prospective adoptive parents, as well as contributions towards their living expenses, both during the pregnancy and for a maximum of 6 weeks after the birth of the child. So depending on her need, she can get her rent paid, food, phone, electric, transportation, insurance, clothing, things of that sort to make sure that she's supported during the pregnancy and the baby is given the best opportunity to come out healthy.
Yeah. What rights do birth fathers have?
It depends on the kind of birth father that he is. In Florida, if the birth father is married to the mother, either at the time that she has the baby or at the time that the baby is born, his consent is required to the adoption. Oh. And the only thing he needs to do during the pregnancy is to make sure that he's supporting the birth mother in a physical and financial way to meet his burden to step up to the plate. The Florida Supreme Court has determined a long time ago that fathers need to be an active role in the birth mother's pregnancy. They just can't sit and wait around for the baby to be born to take action. Okay. On the other hand, if you are not married to the birth mother at the time that she has the baby or at the time she conceives the baby, then you're in a different category. It's a term of art called an unmarried biological father. Now, you could be married to somebody else, but essentially if you're not married to the birth mother, you are determined to be an unmarried biological father. And your consent is not required to the adoption unless you do 3 important things. And one of those is to register your paternity with the Florida Putative Father Registry. It's an easy thing to do, and all the birth fathers out there need to be aware of how to do it, but it's on the Department of Vital Statistics website, and it's a very simple form to fill out and record that information. And it is confidential, so birth fathers don't need to be worried that somebody else is going to find out about it, but it's designed to make sure that they get notice of any intention that the birth mother has to place the child for adoption.
So if they do fill that out, what exactly do they, what sort of options do they have if the birth mother is planning on adopting the child out? They
would, number one, be entitled to notice of that proceeding, because if they don't register, they won't get notice, because there's no opportunity for the adoption agency or the adoptive parents necessarily to know who he is. So it gives them a right to notice, and it may give him a right to block the adoption if, in addition to doing that, he provides that support that I mentioned husbands have the duty to provide. And he also files with the court, upon being served with notice, an affidavit outlining his intentions to provide for that child's support.
So theoretically, he could receive custody?
Oh, absolutely, if he was the determined to be the suitable parent by the court.
Interesting. How has the internet transformed adoption these days?
In giant ways. It has transformed it from the perspective of adoptive parents, because what used to be a process that was shepherded and supervised by adoption professionals is now kind of what I call a click and pick event on the internet, where adoptive parents are looking for birth parents and birth parents are looking for adoptive parents without the watchful eye of adoption professionals. And we have been very concerned about some of the things that have been occurring, because adoptive parents are very vulnerable. Typically, they are not able to conceive children on their own, and so they've been through a lot of heartache. They may have been through infertility and counseling to kind of deal with the raw reality of not being able to conceive biologically. So they're very vulnerable, and sadly there are people out there, women, some of whom are pregnant and some of whom are not, that prey on prospective adoptive parents and promise to place their child for adoption with these folks when they're not even pregnant, or when maybe they are pregnant, they just don't have that intention. And so what we're seeing is some scamming going on, where adoptive parents are providing resources to that birth mother because she can't pay her rent or she doesn't have enough money for food. And at the end of the day, they're left with an empty pocketbook and a heartbreak.
Wow.
I think also, to further that thought, we're seeing in the internet world, on the other side of the equation, birth mothers searching for their adopted children. So children that they place for adoption. And they're trying to maintain and create some communication with that child, which may or may not be with the permission or blessing of the adoptive parents. And certainly that's not appropriate. And so the internet has kind of taken away the boundaries that we typically see in adoption and what we've seen, for many decades now. And I think we can all agree that a 13-year-old shouldn't learn on Facebook that she's adopted because her birth mother has reached out to make contact, And so those are some of the concerns we have, from that side.
Wow. So I never thought about that. So are there dangers to using the internet to locate the birth mother?
There are dangers, and probably the most obvious danger is that you really don't know who you're speaking to on the other end of that email, that video chat, that internet-based communication, and the validity of the communication and the reliability of it is something that is up for question. And I think all of those vulnerabilities that I mentioned a moment ago are ripe for exposure.
When can a consent for adoption be signed?
In Florida, both a birth father, an unmarried biological father, and the husband of the mother can sign what's called an affidavit of non-paternity to relinquish their rights to the child at any time, including before birth. So that sometimes allows the birth mother to engage in adoption planning without concern that the birth father is going to come up later and disrupt that planning. It, of course, gives the adopted parents a lot of comfort to know that that piece of the puzzle is secure and not subject to, to change, because consents for adoption in Florida and affidavits of non-paternity are permanent and irrevocable when they're signed, typically.
Can a birth parent change their mind after they sign, the adoption consent form?
In Florida, when a child is under the age of 6 months, a consent for adoption is permanent and irrevocable when it's signed. There's no opportunity to change your mind. And the only exception to the viability and efficacy of that consent is if it was obtained by fraud or duress. So like any contract, if you were defrauded in connection with the execution of that consent, it would not be a valid consent. But that is something that rarely happens. It's never happened in my office in 30-some years. So typically you can rely on the validity of that consent if, again, you have a competent adoption professional that's engaged in that endeavor for you. Now, for children that are over the age of 6 months, there is a 3-day right of revocation. So the birth parents are given a couple additional days to make sure that this is what they want to do. And they're free to revoke that consent for any reason whatsoever in that 3-day period.
Oh, that's good. What's the difference between an open and a closed adoption?
Cedric, I never like labels, because what an open adoption means to you or to a birth mother might be something different than it means to me. So I typically like to have people identify, what do you mean when you say you want an open adoption? But a closed adoption on the far end of the spectrum would be, a birth mother that doesn't want to know anything about the adoptive parents. She doesn't want to even select the adoptive parents. She delegates that responsibility to the adoption attorney or the adoption agency and says, I understand that all adoptive parents have to go through a very rigorous background screening and home study process to become adoptive parents, and I trust that process. The adoptive parents, on the other hand, would not know anything about the birth mother other than generic medical history that was necessary for them to understand the background information as it relates to the child. In an open situation, it can run the gamut. Birth parents select the adoptive parents. They look at profile books to determine a family that they feel would be most suitable for their child. They have pre-birth meetings with adoptive parents so they can get to know them and have that comfort level more than just on paper. We have birth mothers that have adoptive parents in the delivery room. I've even had adoptive parents cut the umbilical cord.
Wow.
And even that contact can sometimes transcend past placement and past the birth, where the birth mother is getting updates from the adoptive parents, pictures, letters, and information about how the child is growing and developing, because it solidifies the decision that she made to place her child for adoption.
Oh, that's great. If we have any listeners out there who are looking to adopt, how long can they expect to wait? I mean, is it a long waiting process, or?
It can be. I think that the important thing here is, what kind of child do you want to adopt? We have 5,000, yes, that's 5,000 children available today in foster care that want to be adopted, that need to be adopted to provide for their permanency and stability. So if you're willing to adopt a child from foster care, sign up, because the kids need you. If you're looking for a perfect, healthy newborn, your wait could eclipse 18, 24 months, again, depending on what factors you're willing to be, subjected to. We have all kinds of birth mothers with all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of birth father issues, and so it really is kind of a pairing of what the adoptive parents are willing to accept with the situations that are presented.
Okay. How much does adoption cost?
The cost is wide-ranging, depending on the kind of adoption that you're interested in. If you adopt one of those 5,000 children that I just mentioned, the cost is zero. In fact, the state will pay you to adopt that child. They give you a stipend to pay legal fees associated with the finalization of your adoption. They can give you a stipend monthly to provide for any needs that the child might have if the child qualifies as special needs. So on one end of the spectrum, you really can start at zero. And on the other end of the spectrum, you could probably, as an outer reach, get to $30,000 or $35,000. And I know your listeners are probably saying, wow, that's a giant divide. And the reason is that, again, these birth mothers are entitled to have their living expenses paid.
Right.
They're also entitled to their medical expenses and their counseling expenses. So by the time you add all of that up, in addition to legal fees, agency fees, home study fees, you can approach $30,000 or $35,000.
So what is a home study, and when is that required?
Before adoptive parents are able to adopt in the state of Florida and accept a child into their care and custody, they have to have a home study. There's one exception, and that is for relatives who are adopting their relative's child. And it has to be a close relative, what in the legal parlance we say is within the third degree of consanguinity. So it's a very close family relationship. But the home study is an independent investigation designed to assess your suitability as adoptive parents. Are you able to provide appropriate care for this child? So the home study looks at criminal background checks, child abuse background checks, financial stability, employment stability. There's actually an inspection component that's required of the physical environments of the home where the child is going to be raised, to make sure that, there's no radon in the home, to make sure the pool is secure, that any guns are secured, that type of a thing. And then the home study agency will certify the family as able to adopt.
Okay. You're listening to The Legal Forum on the Tan Talk Radio Network. It's 25 after the hour, and we have Jeanne Tate. We're talking adoption, And if you have any questions, you can give us a call in studio at 727-441-3000 or 1-866-826-1340. Any question, we'll get you on really quick. Let's talk about foster care. What if a child is in foster care?
I'm very happy to report that Florida leads the nation on the interface between the public and the private sector. And we have a law on the books that allows birth mothers and birth fathers whose children are in foster care to choose a private adoption for that child. And the beauty of that is the birth parents can actively engage in the adoption planning process for their child. They can pick the adoptive parents. They can meet the adoptive parents. They can get information from the adoptive parents as the child grows and develops. And those are things that are not available in the public sector. Those things are not available if the state is going to keep your child in foster care and terminate your parental rights. So it's an opportunity to really take your child and remove them from the foster care system, which I think we can all agree is not the best place for a child.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
The state just simply doesn't make a good parent.
So how are adoptive parents matched with a birth mother?
This kind of goes back to if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. Right. The birth mother creates, if she wishes, what we call a dream family list, and she provides to the adoption professional the characteristics in a family that is attractive to her. You know, she may say, I want them to be Catholic. I want them to be married for at least 5 years. I don't want them to have ever had a divorce. I do or do not want them to have other children. I want them to travel and enjoy the outdoors or like pets. You know, those kinds of things that make the birth mother feel like she's picked and selected the best family. And then we would go to our waiting list of families and pick profiles that they've created that match her criteria and allow her to look at those profiles, which it's kind of like a creative memory book, pictures of the family, of their home, stories about their background and how they met, so that she could find the most suitable family for her child.
What information will the adoptive parents have about the birth parents?
Florida law requires the adoption professional to provide a long list of information, again, non-identifying because adoption is confidential. No one is ever going to know the identity of a birth parent or an adoptive parent unless those individuals choose to disclose that themselves. But the adoptive parents would get all medical information as it relates to the birth mother and the baby, so prenatal records, records from the hospital following delivery. They would also get background social information that is reported by the birth mother and about herself and her family, and the birth father if he's locatable and the information is available. They also would get any records from the Department of Children and Families if the child had been in foster care. So things like child studies or psychological reports and assessments. I mean, the idea here is that the adoptive parents need as much information as they can to be able to appropriately provide for that child's needs, you know, for the rest of the child's life.
Okay, and what information will the birth parents have on the adoptive parents?
Outside of identifying information, which we cannot disclose without permission, the birth parents really can have whatever information they want. They have the right to ask questions and have those questions honestly answered about the adoptive parents. And as I said, they have the opportunity to have a degree of openness with their adoption that includes them meeting the adoptive parents, asking those questions themselves, or if they don't feel comfortable, asking them through the adoption professional.
And how can the adoptive parents know the expected health of a baby?
Their adoption professional should run tests on the birth mother while pregnant. You know, standard OBGYN testing in addition to drug screening, HIV screening, hepatitis, and things of that sort. And of course, depending on the birth mother and her particular situation, other tests may be indicated to detect any genetic disorders. But that is something they should rely on their adoption professional to secure for them. And
what kind of contact will the adoptive parents have with the birth parents?
really whatever they mutually agree. And again, when we create that dream family list for the birth mother and work with her to identify the parameters of an adoption plan for her, she tells us what kind of contact and openness that she wants in the adoption. She may want closed, she may want open, or some variation thereof. The adoptive parents, on the other hand, when they sign up with my agency, will tell us the same thing, so that there's a meeting of the minds, if you will, that they're both open to openness or they're both not open to openness. So it's a mutual agreed thing.
Now, I'd imagine it could be traumatic for the birth mother. I mean, obviously, and you mentioned something about counseling earlier. Is the birth mother entitled to counseling?
Absolutely. And I really, and it's not my choice to force anyone to do anything,
Right.
but I insist on it to the greatest degree possible, because the birth mother has to live with this decision for the rest of her life, and we want her to be confident and secure in her decision and not, left to ponder that down the road in a way that's not healthy for her healing.
Right. Can birth mothers receive living expenses?
Yes, they can. During the pregnancy and for up to a maximum of 6 weeks after delivery, they may receive living expenses from the adopted parents.
Okay.
In a broad range of categories.
Interesting. What about insurance? Does that cover the adopted child?
The birth mother is entitled to insurance paid by the adopted parents for her, if she's able to get insurance for her medical care. And the adopted parents are also able to purchase insurance to cover the child. We have a wonderful statute in Florida that mandates in almost all settings that the existing coverage that adopted parents have be broadened to cover adopted children, just as if that adopted child were born to the adopted parents. We also have federal legislation that mandates coverage for the adopted child in the same manner that you would for a biologically born child. So adopted parents should not be saddled with extensive uninsured medical bills as a result of an adoption.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
When can an adoption be finalized?
In Florida, the adopted parents have to have the child in their home for a minimum period of 3 months before they're able to finalize their adoption.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And you remember that home study process that we talked about, where their home is investigated and their backgrounds are investigated? The same individual typically goes into the home for that once a month for those 3 months and reports to the court about the suitability and security of that placement. And once the court's convinced after that minimum 90-day period that this is in the best interest of the child, the court will finalize that adoption. There is one caveat to that. In that close relative situation that I mentioned, they don't need to wait that time frame, and they can finalize very promptly after the birth of the child. Okay,
so if they're related to the birth mother and they're adopting, that they can bypass that?
They can bypass that. Again, close relative. Like if your mom's sister, is adopting, that's at the end of that closeness. It can't be a cousin. It can't be a great aunt. It can't be, more distant than that.
Okay, we're talking to Jeanne Tate. The topic today is adoption, and I have a bunch more questions for her, but if you have any questions, you can give us a call, 727-441-3000. And Jeanne, can you please give us some of your information in case people want to contact you off air?
Certainly. An easy way to do so is through our website at www.floridaadoptionattorney.com. I'm also 24/7 on email, which is Jeanne, Jeanne, at jtatelaw.com. And our phone number in Tampa is 813-258-3355. Okay,
great. Now, we were talking about post-placement supervision. What can you tell me about that?
Monthly, the individual that did your home study or another licensed social worker or provider has to go into your home and investigate the placement. They need to see the child. They need to ask questions about how you're managing, the child's needs and the care of the child. And then they fill out and write a report to the court to ensure that the child is safe and secure and the adoption as planned continues to be in the best interest of the child.
And where do you obtain the birth certificate if you're the adoptive parent?
The child is issued an original birth certificate at birth that lists the name of the biological mother. That birth certificate is not available to adoptive parents because it contains the confidential information as it relates to her identity. In addition, of course, the adoptive parents want a birth certificate that has the name of the child that they've selected, in addition has them as the parents of the child. And that birth certificate is issued after they finalize the adoption. So after that 90-day post-placement period is up, they go to court, they have a final judgment of adoption entered, and their adoption professional will then apply for a new birth certificate for the child, and that will come in a couple weeks. So the adoptive parents do not have a birth certificate prior to that time. And I know a lot of our clients are nervous about that. What are we going to do if the child needs medical care and attention? We're not the adoptive parents yet. We're just the custodians during this interim period. And typically we will obtain a court order for the adoptive parents that allows them to seek medical care and treatment and otherwise meet the child's needs during that interim.
And what about the Social Security card?
The Social Security card likewise cannot be obtained until after the adoption's finalized. And that is even longer than the birth certificate process because you need that amended and reissued birth certificate to apply for a Social Security card. But once you get that birth certificate, you go down to Social Security just like everybody else and apply for a new Social Security card. I will say that sometimes adoptive parents have to file their tax returns before they get a Social Security number. So how do they do that? What do they do in that instance? Well, the IRS, in its infinite wisdom, has that situation covered. And they issue what's called an alternate taxpayer identification number, ATIN. And there's a specific form on their website so that if you're not able to get a Social Security number prior to the time your tax return is filed, you can get that temporary interim number to utilize instead.
So what is the tax credit for adoption?
Tax credit?
There isn't?
No, there is a wonderful thing. I used to say it's only a good thing Bill Clinton did in office, but he passed a tax credit, and it allows adoptive parents to get a credit on their tax return of over $13,000 when they adopt a child. And a credit is 100 times better than a deduction because a credit is applied dollar for dollar against any tax liability that you owe. And you get to claim the credit in the year you finalize your adoption. So we typically tell adoptive parents to consult with their CPAs or accountants or other financial planners because they want to owe money at the end of the year so the tax credit wipes that out and they're able to fully utilize the credit. If they're not able to utilize it, it does carry forward for several years so that it is something that will truly benefit them and defray the cost of their adoption.
Now, another question that I was wondering about is during the 90-day trial period or process, before it's finalized, what if there is something that's found to be, these parents aren't fit? Let's say a gun out of a safe or something like that, or alcohol or drugs in the home. What exactly can the adoptive parents do at that point? Is it over for them, or what happens?
That would be a highly dependent factual setting where we'd have to know exactly what happened. I mean, there's certainly things that adoptive parents can do in that 90 days to disqualify themselves permanently from adopting. Mm-hmm. So the child would be removed from their home. The adoption professional would be responsible for identifying other suitable adoptive parents. Sometimes there's situations where the court will prolong that 90-day kind of investigatory period so that the adoptive parents get counseling or they address the problem that has arisen during that trial period. I don't want to create fear in the eyes of adoptive parents because Many of them wait decades
Right.
to be able to have a child. So this is something that rarely happens. Typically the investigations and the studies that are done up front are pretty solid on the fact that these are good people that deserve to adopt a child.
Right.
But this is one area, Cedric, I will tell you that adoptive parents get confused about, because you have this 90-day period where you're not yet adoptive parents and you don't know for sure until it happens that you're going to be able to adopt the child. People get confused and think that that is a period of time that also gives the birth parents a window of opportunity to change their minds. And that is not accurate, because their consents were permanent and irrevocable long ago. And this period of time has nothing to do with resurrecting their rights. It simply has to do with whether or not you're going to be able to finalize the adoption. And if not, other adopted parents, not the birth parents, would step into your shoes.
Now, let's say that I was adopted and I don't know who my birth parents are and I want to find them. What can I do?
Florida has an adoption reunion registry. It's a voluntary registry where birth parents and adopted children can sign up and say, it's okay for you to disclose my identity and my whereabouts to my birth family if they're looking for me. So that's always the first thing that I tell folks to do, because it's very inexpensive to do that, and it's an easy way to perhaps be reunited with your adopted child or with your birth mom or birth dad. Short of that, if there's no mutual registration, you can hire an attorney, and I would say almost in every situation you would absolutely need an attorney to handle this kind of matter for you. But hire an attorney and ask the court to open up your adoption file and allow your attorney the confidential right to contact your birth parents and see if they want to meet you, to reunite with you, to disclose their confidential identity and information. And the attorney is usually precluded by court order from giving you that information. Even though they're your attorney, they can't give it to you unless they have a written permission signed by the birth parents. And that's true for birth parents and adoptive parents. Adoption professionals cannot disclose their identity without their written permission.
Wow. So I assume that there's a lot of situations where there's just a block there where you can't find your adoptive parents then necessarily, right?
There is, and more typically with the internet, it's pretty hard to hide these days.
I'd imagine with Facebook.
Yeah, there's 750 million users of Facebook today, plus. So I think more typically what we see, Cedric, is that a birth parent or an adopted child does not want that reunion. And I would say that's definitely the exception, not the rule. Most people want that. But I think it's important to have therapeutic counseling as adopted children or birth parents embark on this kind of decision, because we don't want that to be another layer of rejection for them, or to have some sense of abandonment about that. There may be really good reasons why they don't want that information disclosed. I mean, I had a recent case where a child that was placed for adoption hired us to find her birth mother. And we did find her birth mother. And she was not open to a relationship. And the reason is that she had been a school teacher up in the Northeast when she got pregnant by a married teacher at her school. Her parents lived in another state, and they never, ever knew she was pregnant. She had come to Florida, had the baby, and returned to teach school the following year. So no one in her life knew that she'd ever had this baby. And 20 years later, for that child to be in her life, it was just way too complicated for her at that time, you know?
Because then she'd have to explain to everyone that she'd been deceiving them for 20 years.
Exactly. And her parents were still alive. You know, I told my client, give it she has our information, give it some more time. As time passes and maybe her parents pass, she might be more receptive to it.
So, one more time. Now, for example, I have a friend. He was adopted by parents who lived in Michigan. From his birth parents were from Chile. if he wanted to find them, he's never been able to find them. How would you suggest for him to do that?
Well, when you say they're from Chile, where was the adoption done?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Well, that would be the key to that. He would know where his adoption occurred because there would be a final judgment of adoption. So that is the state that you would go to investigate the identity of the birth parents. And some states are, unlike Florida, are wide open.
Okay.
If it was Tennessee, once you're 18, you have the right to find out who your birth parents were. And so, if he was lucky enough to have an open state like that, that information may be readily available to him. If not, he might have to hire an attorney in that state to get access to the records, but that's where I'd start for him.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate that. What can you tell us about the Indian Child Welfare Act?
I thought your viewers might be interested in that topic because the internet and the legal world has been abuzz for about 10 months now because of the Baby Veronica case. And the Baby Veronica case was a case where a child whose father was Indian was placed for adoption in South Carolina. And the birth father challenged that adoption. And although it was clear by the facts of the case that if he was non-Indian, his rights to that child should have been terminated. But because of the Indian Child Welfare Act, he was given greater rights and an elevated status by the South Carolina Supreme Court and was able to block that adoption. So this child who had lived with the prospective adoptive parents for 2 years was ordered removed from their home and placed with his biological father, even though he had abandoned the birth mother during the pregnancy and even though he had initially agreed to relinquish his parental rights. The adoptive parents appealed that decision, and quite surprisingly, the United States Supreme Court accepted jurisdiction of the case. And I say quite surprisingly because the United States Supreme Court takes a small fraction of the cases that are presented to it for disposition, 2%. So of the thousands and thousands of cases that are presented every year to the Supreme Court, they take a very small percentage. So it was pretty exciting that it was an adoption case. I think the last adoption case of any import that was decided by the United States Supreme Court was in 1978. So this was a big deal, and all of the adoption organizations and adoption attorneys across the country were very involved in writing amicus briefs and going to Washington to hear argument. And about 2 months ago, the United States Supreme Court determined that the South Carolina Supreme Court was in error in recognizing this birth father's Indian heritage as giving him rights to trump the adoption, and they ordered the return of the child to the adoptive parents. Sadly, after the child had been in the custody of the birth father now for 19 months. Mm-hmm. So you see, there's not a lot of winners in a case like that, and particularly not a child who has been kind of a yo-yo back and forth between different parent figures without any stability or permanency in her life for almost 4 years.
Wow. Yeah, I had heard about that story. What exactly is the situation with that right now?
Well, the situation is that we have a more clear directive on when the Indian Child Welfare Act applies and when it doesn't.
Okay.
And I would say of all the adoption scenarios that your listeners could be confronted with, this is one that's really important to have an adoption attorney, because there are many safeguards under the Indian Child Welfare Act that have to be honored when you do an adoption. For example, when I do an adoption of a non-Indian child, the birth mother signs her consent for adoption outside a courtroom 48 hours after birth.
Okay.
If she were Indian, that would be an invalid consent, because I have to take her consent before a judge, number one, and number two, I have to wait at least 10 days before she's able to sign that consent. So again, just really important to have legal counsel navigate those difficult waters.
Okay, and again, how can people contact you if they're looking for adoption, an adoption attorney?
Well, my website's a good place at www.floridaadoptionattorney.com. Our phone number is 813-258-3355. And I'm always on email at Jeanne, Jeanne, @JTateLaw.com. identifies.law.com, or you can just Google my name. You'll find me.
Excellent. Now, I just have to ask, how did you get into this? I mean, what made you decide adoption law was it for you?
It's kind of a funny story, but I worked at a very blue stocking law firm with 65 lawyers when I first graduated from law school, and the firm had been in existence for 90-some years, and they never had a woman partner. So when I accepted the job offer there, one of my goals was to become one of the first women partners there. And to be able to do that, you had to create a book of business. And I didn't know how I was going to do that. My mother was a waitress. My father was a high school dropout. And I'm like, how am I going to get, commercial litigation cases? Because that's what I was doing. Admiralty and securities and construction referred to me. I'm a peon. I just graduated from law school and I don't know anything. So I decided to carve out 30% of my time, never ever dreaming that I was going to be an adoption attorney down the road, and work on high-end divorce and adoption, because I figured that these 65 lawyers were at the firm. They liked me. They respected me. They hired me. I could cross-sell to them, and they could promote me to their clients. And it was an area that my firm had no attorneys doing. So it was kind of an open avenue for me, and it worked, fortunately.
Oh, we just got a message in here. The question from a listener wants to know the age limits. Are there any sort of age limits on adoption and adoptive parents?
No, not at all. The question is, are you a suitable adoptive parent for a child? So there are no age limits, and there are also no marriage requirements. Single individuals can adopt, male or female. And just recently, Florida erased a ban on homosexuals adopting that had been in existence since the 70s.
So you could be 80 years old and adopt if you wanted to.
As long as you were suitable. I mean, there may be some questions raised about your longevity and your ability to be there for that child through, the age of minority.
Yeah. So you might not be adopting a 2-year-old, or
might not be adopting a 2-year-old. That's right. That's right.
So what can you tell us about the Interstate Compact for the placement of children?
Very important law that adoptive parents need to be aware of if they're adopting a child across state lines. So if your adoptive parents are in Georgia and the baby was born in Florida, or vice versa, you may not take that child across state lines without the permission of both the Florida Interstate Compact Office and the Georgia Interstate Compact Office. And they only give that permission after you provide them with a long list of documentation so that they can verify the suitability and legality of the placement. So they review home studies, they review the consent relinquishment documents signed by the birth parents, they review medical records of the child so that the adoptive parents, we know for certain, have full information and disclosure about that. So again, another area where competent adoption advice is crucial.
Okay, and how does the Interstate Compact work?
Adoptive parents get frustrated by how it works because it works like most bureaucracies, slowly, and without any control, not only by the adoptive parents, but by the attorney for the adoptive parents. But the process starts on the side where the state that delivered the baby. So let's say the baby was born in Florida. The Florida attorney would file all of the Interstate Compact documents with the Florida Interstate Compact Office. They would, over a period of about a week, review those documents, approve the placement, and then send those documents to Georgia ICPC office, and the Georgia ICPC office would do the same thing. Then they would report back to Florida that they've approved the placement, and then the Florida office would contact me and say it was approved and the adoptive parents may go to Georgia with the baby.
Okay.
So this process is also exempt for relatives. So relatives do not have to comply with Interstate Compact.
Interesting. We're talking with Jeanne Tate. She's an adoption attorney, and she's our guest for the next few minutes here. We have time maybe for one call to get in. It's 727-441-3000 or 1-866-826-1340. I can tell you're really passionate about this. This is the only area of law that you practice, right?
It is, and I am very passionate about it because, again, I feel like we do God's work
right
when we're able to save kids from foster care, and find children adoptive homes. And there's so many ways people can get involved. If this is something that's interesting to your listeners, people say, well, I can't adopt a child, but there's ways to mentor children. There's ways to be financially supportive of adoption. So we all have the ability to give our time, our treasures, our talents to children without necessarily adopting. But we love adoptive parents most.
Oh, of course. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think there are any flaws in the system?
I think that any system that you have that is written in a statute and designed to cover any conceivable scenario that arises has flaws to the extent that we have litigation that takes years and years to resolve, like baby Veronica, instead of a truncated process that would allow her to have permanency and stability at a much earlier date. For baby Veronica's future to hang in the balance for 4 years, wow, that's way, way too long. So to the extent that the judicial system can expedite resolution of these cases, that I think is something to work on, and that is definitely a flaw in our system. And not all flaws are fixable because, on the other side, we need to honor the due process rights of parents, birth fathers and birth mothers, to fight the fight if that's what they want to do, and to honor their right to be a parent if it's in the best interest of a child for them to do so.
And what do you think the most important piece of advice is that you could give to prospective adoptive parents?
Hire a competent adoption attorney. This is a very difficult area of the law in Florida. Our legislature has made adoption difficult. It has changed dramatically in the 30-plus years that I've been doing that. And it is not an easy task. And a lot of my day, a lot of my week, a lot of my time is spent fielding calls from adoptive parents who have not hired a competent adoption professional.
And is there anything else important that you'd like to share with the listening audience? Anything at all?
Don't be afraid to adopt. The Evan B. Donaldson came up with a study that the amount of people that are willing to adopt and that want to adopt is ginormous. Mm-hmm. But the amount of people that ultimately do adopt is a very small fraction of that. And so they get dissuaded along the way, maybe because they haven't hired the right attorney, mm-hmm. or because they don't know how to navigate the bureaucracy of the system. But let's not give up on these kids. There are people out there that can help you navigate that successfully. So don't give up.
Excellent. Jeanne Tate, thank you so much for coming on the Legal Forum. Again, please give us all your information, because I know there's people out there that are interested in becoming adoptive parents, or maybe they're interested in finding their adoptive parents. You can help with that too, right?
I can.
Excellent. Or sorry, their birth parents, pardon me. And please give your information again.
My website is www.adoptionattorney.com. Phone number 813-258-3355. And my email is jeannie@jtatelaw.com. And if you forget all that, just Google Jeanne Tate. You'll find me.
Okay, and we'll have the podcast up on our website, tantalk1340.com. If you missed the show, you can go back and listen to any of the questions we had here and get the answers. You're listening to The Legal Forum on Tampa Bay's Tan Talk Radio Network. Jeanne, thank you so much for coming in. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Cedric.
I appreciate it. You're listening to the Tan Talk Radio Network. Tom O'Brien's coming up next after news and traffic. Don't touch that dial. Thanks again, Jeanne.
WTAN, Clearwater, Tampa Bay. WDCF, Dade City, Tampa Bay. WZHR, Zephyr Hills, Tampa Bay. Listen.